Well, looks like Bryan Kohberger is one step closer to getting a new trial because a new attorney has been appointed to represent him as he fights to withdraw his guilty plea. 31-year-old Kohberger, who pleaded guilty last year to the 2022 murder of 4 University of Idaho students, filed a handwritten petition last week claiming he was forced to falsely confess by his former legal team, among other allegations. And if he's able to withdraw his plea, that may pave a way for a whole new trial, a whole new legal episode. And yesterday, Greg Rauch, a local attorney from Moscow, Idaho, was tapped to represent the killer. Though if Kohberger is expected to be seated in court anytime soon, he's got another thing coming because Rauch told Fox News Digital on Monday that he hasn't read the petition, the case file. He hasn't even spoken to Kohberger yet, telling the outlet, I got to read the case file, I got to check out the police reports, I got to talk.
The courtroom was supposed to be the place where one of America's most haunting murder cases finally came to an end. Bryan Kohberger stood before a judge, admitted his guilt, accepted for consecutive life sentences, and walked away without the possibility of parole. For the families of Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, it wasn't the ending they had hoped for, but it was, at least, an ending. Or so everyone believed. Now, just 1 year later, Bryan Kohberger is asking the courts to erase that guilty plea entirely. He claims he was pressured into confessing. He says his attorneys misled him and withheld information. He now wants the opportunity to stand trial instead. These are allegations made in his post-conviction petition. No court has accepted those claims, and he remains convicted and imprisoned while the legal process continues. If the court agrees to even consider his request, one of the most closely watched criminal cases in recent American history could once again dominate headlines. But is this a genuine legal challenge? Or simply the latest chapter in a case that refuses to stay closed? Welcome back to True Crime Evidence, where we break down the facts behind the headlines. If you believe the truth matters more than speculation, subscribe to True Crime Evidence and turn on notifications so you never miss our latest investigations. If you have thoughts on this case, leave them in the comments below. We read every comment, and your perspective could be featured in our next video. Stay with us, because before we examine the new petition, we need to understand exactly how Bryan Kohberger went from pleading guilty to now insisting he deserves another chance. November 13th, 2022. It was a quiet Sunday morning in Moscow, Idaho. Inside a rented home near the University of Idaho campus, 4 college students had been brutally stabbed to death. 21-year-old Kaylee Goncalves, 21-year-old Madison Mogen, 20-year-old Xana Kernodle, and 20-year-old Ethan Chapin. The attack stunned not only the small college town, but the entire country. There were no immediate arrests, no obvious suspect, no public explanation for why these 4 young students had been targeted. As days turned into weeks, fear spread across the campus. Students wondered whether a killer was still walking free. Meanwhile, investigators worked around the clock. The investigation would eventually involve local police, the Idaho State Police, and the FBI, making it one of the largest homicide investigations in the state's history. Then, more than 6 weeks later, everything changed. On December 30th, 2022, authorities arrested Bryan Kohberger at his family's home in Pennsylvania. He wasn't a stranger with a violent criminal record. He was a criminology PhD student studying criminal justice. Almost immediately, public attention exploded. People wanted answers. Who was Bryan Kohberger? Why these victims? And perhaps the biggest question of all, what evidence convinced investigators they had found the right suspect? Over the months that followed, prosecutors outlined evidence they said connected Kohberger to the crime, including DNA recovered from a knife sheath, surveillance footage, cell phone data, and vehicle evidence. Kohberger's defense challenged aspects of the prosecution's case before the plea agreement was reached, but the case never proceeded to a full trial because of his later guilty plea. As legal proceedings continued, the possibility of a death sentence loomed over the case. Then came the decision that changed everything. In July 2025, Bryan Kohberger agreed to plead guilty. The agreement meant prosecutors would no longer seek the death penalty. Instead, he would receive 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Inside the courtroom, the judge carefully questioned him. Did he understand what he was doing? Was anyone forcing him to plead guilty? Was he pleading guilty because he was, in fact, guilty? At the time, Kohberger answered those questions in a way that allowed the court to accept the plea and bring the criminal case to a close. Court records show he confirmed under oath that he understood the agreement and that no undisclosed promises had been made to influence his decision. For many people, that should have been the final chapter. The victims' families could begin rebuilding their lives. The public could finally stop asking whether there would ever be justice. But behind prison walls, something was changing, and no one outside the prison knew it. Until now. Nearly a year after admitting guilt, Bryan Kohberger filed a petition asking the court to let him withdraw that guilty plea. He now claims his attorneys pressured him into accepting the deal by giving him false information and failing to disclose evidence he believes could have helped his defense. Those are Kohberger's allegations, and the court has not ruled that they are true. The filing immediately reignited national debate. Can someone who admitted guilt simply change their mind? Could this case actually return to court? And if it does, what happens to all of the evidence that prosecutors said proved their case? That's where this story becomes even more complicated. Because under American law, asking to withdraw a guilty plea is one thing. Actually convincing a judge to allow it is something entirely different. For nearly a year, the case appeared to be over. Bryan Kohberger had admitted guilt in open court. The judge accepted his plea. The victims' families began trying to move forward. But behind the walls of the Idaho Maximum Security Institution, something was happening that almost no one saw coming. Instead of accepting his sentence, Bryan Kohberger began preparing to fight the conviction he had once accepted. And when the public finally learned what he was asking the court to do, the reaction was immediate. On July 27, 2026, Kohberger filed a handwritten petition asking the court to let him withdraw the guilty plea he entered the previous year. This wasn't a routine appeal. Instead, he chose a different legal path known as post-conviction relief. That distinction matters. A direct appeal usually argues that legal errors occurred during the trial or sentencing. But because Kohberger pleaded guilty and waived many appeal rights as part of the plea agreement, he is now trying to convince the court that something much more serious happened before he ever entered that plea. If the court agrees to even consider his claims, the legal process could reopen. But first, the judge has to determine whether those claims meet an extremely high legal standard. According to his petition, Kohberger now says he was convinced to falsely confess. He alleges that his former attorneys pressured him into accepting the plea agreement by giving him false information and making promises that were never fulfilled. Among his allegations, he claims he was told life in prison would include privileges such as employment, greater freedom of movement, and contact visits. His lawyers exaggerated or misrepresented what life on Idaho's death row would be like. They failed to properly discuss or disclose evidence that he believes could have supported his defense. He maintains that he is actually innocent despite previously admitting guilt in court. It's important to pause here. These are Kohberger's allegations contained in his court filing. They have not been proven in court, and prosecutors have not accepted them. Here's where the case becomes far more complicated. When Bryan Kohberger pleaded guilty in 2025, the judge didn't simply accept his confession. Instead, the court carefully questioned him. The judge asked whether anyone had threatened him, whether anyone had forced him, whether any promises had been made outside the written agreement, and most importantly, whether he was pleading guilty because he was actually guilty. According to the court record, Kohberger answered that he understood the agreement, that he was entering it voluntarily, and that he was pleading guilty because he was guilty. He also confirmed that no additional promises had influenced his decision. Those answers now create one of the biggest obstacles in his new legal challenge. Because today, he's saying something very different. Courts take guilty pleas extremely seriously. Before accepting one, judges go through a detailed process designed to make sure defendants understand exactly what they're doing. That's because once a guilty plea is accepted, it becomes much harder to undo. Legal experts say that after sentencing, Idaho law generally requires a defendant to show a manifest injustice before a guilty plea can be withdrawn. That is a much higher standard than simply saying, "I wish I hadn't pleaded guilty." Instead, Kohberger must convince the court that something fundamentally unfair happened. The defense team now under scrutiny. Another remarkable aspect of this petition is that it directly challenges the work of the attorneys who represented him. Those lawyers spent years defending Kohberger against one of the most closely watched murder prosecutions in America. They filed numerous motions. They challenged evidence. They argued against the death penalty. Ultimately, they negotiated the plea agreement that spared Kohberger from a possible death sentence. Now, the very legal team that helped save his life has become the focus of his allegations. His former attorneys have not publicly accepted those accusations, and the court has not found that they acted improperly. Because Kohberger's petition accuses his previous attorneys of ineffective assistance, the court has appointed a new attorney to represent him in these post-conviction proceedings. That doesn't mean the court believes his allegations. It simply means he is entitled to legal representation while the claims are evaluated. The new attorney's role will be to review the petition, examine the record, and determine how to proceed. But even with new counsel, one enormous question remains. Can any lawyer overcome what Kohberger himself said under oath in open court? That may become the defining issue of this entire case. At first glance, Bryan Kohberger's petition sounds dramatic. He says he was pressured. He says he was misled. He says he never should have pleaded guilty. But court filings are only one side of the story. The law requires much more than allegations. It requires proof. For Bryan Kohberger, this latest filing is another legal battle. For his attorneys, it's another complex court proceeding. But for four families, it's something entirely different. It's another reminder that even after a guilty plea, their search for peace still isn't over. When Bryan Kohberger pleaded guilty in 2025, many of the victims' families believed they could finally begin moving forward. Nothing could erase what happened. Nothing could bring back Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, or Ethan Chapin. But at least the courtroom battles appeared to be over. Now, everything has changed again. Kohberger's petition has reopened painful memories that many families hoped they would never have to relive. Some relatives have publicly criticized the filing, describing it as another attempt to prolong the case and force families back into the spotlight after years of grief. One of the strongest public reactions came from Kaylee Goncalves' family. They said they weren't shocked by Kohberger's latest move. After years of following every hearing, every motion, and every delay, they expected another legal challenge. But they also made something else clear. If Bryan Kohberger wants a trial, they're prepared to face him in court. The family has repeatedly expressed confidence in the prosecution's evidence and has said they are ready if the legal process continues. That response reflects something many families in long-running criminal cases experience. They may not welcome another court battle, but they're prepared for one if that's what justice requires. Right now, many headlines make it sound as though Bryan Kohberger is about to receive a new trial. That's not what has happened. Here's where the case actually stands. He has filed a petition for post-conviction relief. The court has appointed a new attorney to represent him because his petition accuses his former legal team of ineffective assistance. That attorney will review the case, evaluate the claims, and may file additional legal documents. Only then will the court decide whether Kohberger has presented enough evidence to justify moving forward. At this moment, his guilty plea remains in effect. His conviction remains in effect. And he remains in prison serving for consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. If the judge concludes that Kohberger has not shown sufficient legal grounds, the petition can be denied. If that happens, his conviction stands exactly as it does today. He would remain incarcerated under the same sentence imposed in 2025, although additional appellate or post-conviction options could still exist under the law depending on future. But suppose the judge decides the petition deserves further consideration. That still doesn't automatically mean a new trial. There could be evidentiary hearings. Witnesses could testify. Documents could be reviewed. Arguments would be presented by both sides. Only if the court ultimately determines that the guilty plea should be set aside would the criminal case move toward another trial. That would reopen one of the most closely watched homicide cases in modern American history. And prosecutors could once again present the evidence they previously said linked Kohberger to the murders. Even after years of investigation, one question continues to capture public attention. Why? Why these four students? Why this house? Why that night? Bryan Kohberger's guilty plea brought a legal conclusion, but it did not answer every question people had about motive. If there were ever another trial, more evidence and testimony could become public, but there is no guarantee that every unanswered question would be resolved. Sometimes, even the biggest criminal cases leave mysteries behind. The Idaho murders have remained one of the most discussed true crime cases in America for nearly 4 years. Not simply because of the crimes themselves, but because almost every major development has raised new questions. The arrest, the evidence, the plea agreement, the sentencing, and now, a petition asking the court to erase that guilty plea. Whether Bryan Kohberger's legal strategy succeeds or fails, one thing is certain. The courts, not social media, not television, and not public opinion, will decide what happens next. Until then, every new filing will be examined, every hearing will be watched, and every decision will matter. As of today, Bryan Kohberger remains a convicted murderer serving for consecutive life sentences. His petition to withdraw his guilty plea has not been granted. No new trial has been ordered. No conviction has been overturned. The legal process is continuing exactly as the law requires. As this story develops, True Crime Evidence will continue bringing you verified facts, careful analysis, and updates based on court records, not rumors or speculation. If you found this breakdown informative, make sure you subscribe to True Crime Evidence and turn on notifications so you never miss our latest investigations and courtroom updates. If you were the judge in this case, would you allow Bryan Kohberger to withdraw his guilty plea and face a jury trial? Or do you believe the case should remain exactly where it is? Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments below. We read every comment, and your perspective could be featured in a future discussion. Until next time, stay informed, stay objective, and always follow the evidence. This is True Crime Evidence.